The first Gann marriage for which Allen Harris acted as bondsman was in 1837 for my second great-grandfather, Adam Alfred Gann, when he married Jane Susanna La Follette. Here she is called Susan. Adam Alfred commonly went by his middle name Alfred throughout life, which is what appears here, Alfred Gann and Susan La Follette. My grandmother was named Susan, and so this family name travels right back to Susanna La Follette, who was called Susan. I introduced this particular record at last year's presentation. Allen Harris was Adam Alfred's uncle by marriage. The next marriage bond I'm going to show you is the dream find of every researcher, and it teaches us why we need to read every document carefully and extract the full meaning of each word. It's exactly the kind of document one hopes to find in this early American period before birth records existed on the civil level and state level. It's the marriage bond of when Henry married Annie. That sort of sounds like a movie, doesn't it? And it could be a good one because there are some subplots involved here. This marriage, as I have said twice now, is a genealogist's dream find because it contains one little two-letter word, by, B-Y, right next to Allen Harris's name in the middle of the document. And that word carries an extraordinary package of meaning. This record can by itself stand alone as evidence that not only supports Henry's birth year that is etched into his gravestone, but it also is going to tell us who his parents were. I have some arrows and circles here. First of all, this little word by tells us that Henry is underage, and he could not get a marriage bond on his own without having a legal relative sign for him. Are there any attorneys, any lawyers in here? I saw a hand. Barbara? Right, excellent. If you can add anything to this, you're absolutely welcome.
Not my area of expertise, but basically if you're underage, you have to have a
That's right. You have to have a legal relative.
Right.
Yes. So Henry needed to have a legal relative sign for him, which gave the county the family's authority to issue a marriage bond, by which issuance gave Henry the legal right to marry Annie. Did I sound legal enough there? Okay. This word by, therefore, tells us that we need to understand how the law of this period of 1842 determined who legal relatives were and who they could be.
Just curious, how old was Annie?
How old was Annie?
At that time.
Annie is the same age as Henry. Women were generally allowed to get married at an earlier age, but apparently 18 was the norm for the area at this time. We see Allen M. Harris's name 3 times at the blue arrows. The first arrow names the applicants for the marriage bond. So it names the bridegroom, Henry, and it names his bondsman, who is Allen. The middle arrow points to where it says Henry, his Mark Gann, by Allen M. Harris. Henry was a minor, and he was not old enough to get a marriage bond on his own accord without having someone who could literally, and legally sign his X for him. If you have ever heard the saying, and I know you have, that somebody had to sign for him to get married, well, this is an example, and it's an original, pure example of someone signing for someone to get married. He didn't fill out a permission slip, da-da-da-da-da-da. He signed for him. He's a legal relative. So he signed for Henry to get married. And this tells us that Allen M. Harris is Henry's legal relative. At the bottom blue arrow, Alan M. Harris signs his own name as the bondsman. So what is a legal relative? Under broad condition, a legal relative was a person that the law recognized as being the person most closely related to another who had legal authority to act for that person. Henry's a minor, so Alan had to be a closest relative to the parent of the minor. We have layers of legality issues here, and we need to understand how each one of those apply in this specific genealogical case. First off, we need to understand there's a difference between Alan Harris's function as a bondsman and Adam Alfred's marriage that I just showed you on the previous slide, versus his function in Henry's marriage. Adam Alfred was of age when he married. He was over 18. Henry was not. Henry was probably about 17 years old, because a 17-year-old would be much more likely to be getting married than a 14, 15, or 16-year-old would. Age 17 would give Henry a birth year of 1825, and that squares exactly with the birth year that we saw on his gravestone. A bondsman is almost always a close member of the family or a kinsman, and that's why marriage bonds provide valuable genealogical information when we can determine a relationship to the bondsman. But a groom of legal marriageable age would have been free to ask any other male of legal age to be his bondsman, whether the person was a kinsman or not. Sometimes best friends were asked to stand good. Adam Alfred asked Alan Harris to be his bondsman, which helped us place Adam Alfred within his family, but he would have been free to ask anybody he wanted to stand good for him, whether the person was a relative or not. Henry's case is completely different. Being underage when he married, he had no such choice of a pick for a bondsman. The bondsman had to be a closest relative who had legal authority to give consent for Henry to get married. Now remember, the term is bondsman, not bondsperson, and not bondswoman. Alan Harris was Henry's legal relative because at that time in our cultural and social and legal systems, husbands took headship roles for their wives' minor relatives and had the authority to act on the relative's behalf. When men married, they assumed clearly understood roles that they would fulfill for their wives' families. We see Alan M. Harris in that capacity right here. That Alan M. Harris was Henry's bondsman tells us everything we need to know to identify who Henry's mother was, because we know who Alan Harris's wife was. Alan Harris's wife was Martha Jane Gann, and Martha Jane was Mary Gann's sister. Henry was Mary Gann's son. May I have some applause now? Or here in the South we say, can I get an amen for that? Before we move to Henry's paternal issue, there is one other issue of additional critical importance to our family history that needs to be answered by further research, and I've not been able to find an answer on that. And the question is, would a full sister of the mother have taken legal precedence over a half-brother of the mother? In other words, would Alan Harris have been a closer legal relative to Mary, and thus to Henry, than Alexander Gann would have been? If that can be answered affirmatively by the law in place at that time, then we will have strong, clear evidence that Mary Gann was indeed born a Gann daughter of Elizabeth and would not and could not have been a Farrer daughter. Mary Gann was born right on that cusp of time between Elizabeth's Farrer marriage and her Gann marriage to probable James Gann. And there has always been some little question, well, could she be one or the other? And I think we can be right on the cusp of determining by legal statutes in place at the time which she would be. I'm going to address Henry's legal paternity issues here. A legal relative was defined by statute law and depended on the circumstances of a person's birth. Because Mary did not have a legal husband, Mary's children did not have any legal paternal relatives to their Gann name. Not a single one. All of those biological Birchfield half-brothers that Henry grew up in the midst of were not legal half-brothers. The law did not recognize them as being brothers because Mary's children were never formally legitimated. Thus, the only legal relatives Henry ever had were his maternal relatives. None of Henry's biological paternal relatives could have legally signed for him to get married. When correlated with the 1830 and 1840 censuses, which we will look at, Henry's marriage bond forms a perfect trifecta of further evidence to show that Henry Gann, who was born in 1825 and who married Annie Lindsay in April 1842, was Mary Gann's fourth son. But before we take a look at the 1830 and 1840 censuses to see how they correlate to Henry's marriage record, let's look at the third Gann marriage for Allen M. Harris, that Allen M. Harris was bondsman to. About 6 weeks after he was bondsman for underage Henry, Allen was also the bondsman for a William Gann. We know this is not William Anderson Gann because William Anderson married Rebecca S. Thomas, though we do not know where that marriage occurred because a record of it has never been found. This marriage, this William was at least 18 years of age when he married, so he didn't need anyone to sign for him. So we know by that he was born sometime earlier than 1824. We saw earlier in Henry's 1847 deed from Job Parrott that there was a William Gann who was closely linked to Henry Gann because William served as a witness to the deed of the 50 acres that adjoined Mary Gann's property. Suggested by the use of the same bondsman is that this William is most likely the same William who is close enough to Henry that he served as Henry's witness. In this bond, we see that William Gann was planning to marry Elizabeth LaFollette, spelled Layfollette here, and could indicate pronunciation in that area at that time. Elizabeth's sister Susan, as you recall, had married Adam Alfred Gann in 1837. That was the first bond I showed you, the one for my second great-grandparents. The LaFollette sisters were granddaughters of Ignatius Nathan Gann. Is it plausible that two Gann brothers would marry two LaFollette sisters? Absolutely, completely so. Siblings oftentimes married other siblings. In fact, my aunt, who could not be here with us today, who is also a Gann, she and her baby sister married two brothers. Is it plausible that two brothers of legal age to marry would call on a same uncle by marriage to stand good for them? Yeah, absolutely. Is it plausible that one brother might have named his firstborn son after the other brother? Adam Alfred Gann named his firstborn son William Vineyard Gann. There appears to be more than coincidence at work here. We have to ask, could this William Gann, who married Elizabeth LaFollette, be Adam Alfred's brother? Could this William Gann be George Daniel Gann's brother? Could this William be Henry Gann's brother? And of course we do know from that chart that I showed you earlier that they were linked together as brothers. You recall that I mentioned that Henry's marriage bond was part of a perfect trifecta that correlates with the 1830 and 1840 censuses. Let's keep that thought in mind and let's take a 15-minute break and then we will resume. Does it sound good?